and threats against cattle ranchers and land detachments.
Yes. So that was a large part of what they did, was this sort of, again, policing race. Eventually, when California was settled by Anglos, there was also quite a lot of action by sheriffs doing things like they were very concerned about what they called vagrants, what we might now call houseless people, right? So this has always been a concern in California. There are deep concerns about these many unmarried men who are coming to work in California, and many of them formed sort of small camps, and sheriffs and their posses would kind of be tasked with this job of keeping these maybe unruly people. Also a huge amount of violent policing against Chinese Americans, which was another large immigrant group, particularly in California. So they had this sort of, I think, like I said, quasi-military function in the West. In the South, what happened was after the Civil War, when slavery officially ended, sheriffs became something like what the enslavers had been. So they took, many of the counties and parishes, if you're talking about Louisiana, they were formed as a result of basically the boundary lines of plantations. So the sheriff would sort of be the head law enforcement in that particular area, and they served, quite frankly, really as white supremacist actors. I did a lot of research into post-Reconstruction violence, and I think what's interesting there is that one of the first things Black Americans wanted to do was elect Black sheriffs. This was a very natural thing. They wanted to take control of law enforcement in their county, and the idea was that if they elected a Black sheriff, that sheriff would protect them from forces like the Klan. Very logical thing to do. Now, it turned out that white people did not like that at all. And there's a quote that I found from someone saying that they would rather see a Black person elected to any other office than sheriff. And I think that points to how the sheriff was seen as the local figure who maintained the racial segregation.
As you write in your book, to this day, 90% of sheriffs are white. Oh.
That's correct. We still see it to this day.
One of the things that sheriffs were able to do that, and some of the remnants of those practices today.
Yes. So sheriffs, particularly in the South, were participating in a program called convict leasing. And in essence, what would happen is the sheriff, who at that time worked on a fee system. So historically, sheriffs worked fee for service. So they would get paid to hold people, and then they got their fee when someone came and picked that person up for whatever reason. That was how they worked. They got paid to serve a warrant or paid to serve papers, right? They were paid for service. And this tradition persists today, which is why sheriffs among law enforcement officers still have a lot of pay per service mechanisms. In many places, for example, landlords pay the sheriff to evict tenants. It's just a flat fee. So among also those things was that they would take people and lease them out to white landowners. They didn't just lease them out for farming. They were sent to mines, to poultry processing plants. In Florida, they were sent to collect tar in the Everglades. And I think it can't be understated just how dangerous and violent convict leasing was.
We see the use of inmates to do manual labor, even today.
Yes, people who are in jails do a lot of labor, and most of that is, honestly, it goes to the benefit of the sheriff. So in some states, particularly Louisiana is one of those, where they can still lease out individuals in the jail for labor. Some of them are leased out for public companies, so like companies cleaning up after Hurricane Katrina, for example. Some are doing dangerous work, like roofing. And of course, then there's the abuse of those. So there were multiple instances in which sheriffs in other states too, so not just Louisiana, but in Texas and California and even in the East Coast, where they would use people in the jail to do things like wash their cars, mow their lawn, set up barbecues was a really common one. So they would hire people to basically set up their, let's say, campaign launch barbecue. It's common. It's very, very common.
What about sheriff reform overall? You've touched on this throughout our conversations. Why are most states wary of legislating sheriffs?
Most states want to legislate their police. Well, there was a great movement in 2020 for states to legislate their police. And we saw a lot of states try to do it. I think two things. One is that interest in legislating police in 2020 has faded, unfortunately. So we've seen states lose interest in that. We've seen a bit of a rollback in terms of some of these proposed reforms. Second is sheriffs have run a very successful campaign arguing that they can't be legislated. It's kind of genius if you think about it. They form a small group. So most states have a state sheriff association, and they will go to the legislature and lobby and testify. One of the things about sheriffs as political figures is the ability to do this kind of political lobbying, which is a bit odd from law enforcement. But they will lobby for laws that they don't like, and they will say, well, I don't like this law. We don't want to do it, and we think you can.